Housing and the CSJ, we're a think tank that works on issues related to poverty and those with low incomes, modest means in communities that experience multiple forms of deprivation. Why would we care about housing? Well, housing, as we've heard from so many of the charities that we work with on any of the issues, be it education or debt or family support, any of the other issues that we work on, so many have said how important it is that housing, good quality housing, and good tenure, a thriving community provides the platform that is necessary to work on the root causes of social disadvantage and poverty. And that's why the CSJ is focused on housing. And I think it's always worth remembering the stories of people's lives, people's homes, behind all the grand statistics that highlight in a more impersonal way just how serious the housing crisis that we have is, with 1.2 million people, households in fact, on a waiting list. 120,000 children will go to sleep tonight in temporary accommodation, not to mention the much more discussed issues around house prices being high, the ratio of earnings to house prices, and so forth. So it's with that in mind that we're really excited that this is our first event today in a full programme. We're also very grateful to the G15. Thank you very much for making this possible. And on our panel today we have Hart MP, who is MP for Hastings and Rye. She is Vice Chair of the Homelessness APPG. She's Officer in the Housing and Social Mobility APPG and Chair of the Coastal Communities APPG. John Penrose MP. He is recently the United Kingdom Anti-Corruption Champion and has been Minister of State for Northern Ireland, among other ministerial areas of responsibility. He published a report, Poverty Trapped, and has highlighted how changes in the planning system can go to alleviate issues in the housing crisis. And two leading figures in the world of housing, we have Geeta Nanda, who is the CEO of MTVH, Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing Association, which is a very large housing association, and also chair of the G15 group, which is a group of London's largest housing associations. And Liam Halligan, who is a British economist, journalist, author, broadcaster with GB News, and has written a book on this very issue, Home Truths, which is recommended reading very much so on this topic. And I must read it actually. You can sign it as well if you like. But as the markets are, of course, going through turbulent times, Liam will have to rush off to be on a television screen near you very, very soon. So we'll pass over to Liam to open with initial remarks. Liam.
Well, I'm delighted to be here. Thank you, Dr. Bruce. Thank you to G15, of course, and to CSJ, particularly Hilary Nichols, who has helped me to be here now. I'm sorry, I may have to, I'm literally watching my phone like an obsessed millennial, because I have to go to the GB newsstand pretty much at any minute, so thank you for allowing me to go first ahead of such a distinguished panel. How long do you want me to speak for, Sam?
5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. In that 5 minutes, I'm going to mention 6 statistics, hopefully. So I wrote Home Truths in November 2019, the paperback came out in early 2021. So it's very much been sort of submerged the housing debate under lockdown and now financial angst, even though everyone in this room knows that it is right up there among probably the most important political issues. You know, so many of our problems go back to housing, both right up and down the income scale, not least among the most deprived families. When I wrote Home Truths, the paperback, somebody called Sajid Javid wrote the introduction for me, the preface, and in it he signalled his support for something I've been calling for, which is a Competition and Markets Authority inquiry into our big house builders. They are an oligopoly. That's the House of Lords Economic Affairs Select Committee used that word. Recently, Housing Secretary Michael Gove used the word cartel, which of course the house builders would deny, because being a cartel is against the law. Also in that preface, Sajid Javid signalled firmly his support, again, for a central argument in the book, which is to repeal the 1961 Land Compensation Act. I don't need to explain what that act is and what it does to a lot of people in this room. And Sajid Javid, he also endorsed my proposal for planning gain to be split 50-50. The UK is a complete outlier when it comes to splitting planning gain. Across the world, even in lots of the areas of the United States, split planning gain, not grubby S106 deals that are then reversed in negotiation or CIL payments that are never made, but proper systemic sharing, splitting of planning gain, with the receipts being held by local authorities so they can build infrastructure, so you can revolutionise the local politics of planning. It simply has to happen. It's not a panacea, but it is, I think, a prerequisite of solving this madness where 70% of the value of any house built these days is the land upon which it is built. So my 6 statistics quickly. My first statistic is 8.6 times. 8.6 times is the multiple, the affordability multiple. So the average house now in the UK, the average house costs 8.6 times the average wage, and that's across UK number. That's madness. Of course, in London and the South East, lots of the North West, even parts of the North East and the South West, it's much, much more. If you are 2 people in a couple, you're both working full time, even before childcare, and you can get 3 times on your mortgage now, maybe that's going down, you've got 6 times, and that's to buy the average home. That's unanswerably, the statistic is unanswerable. It means the average person can't buy a home, and we're meant to be a nation of homeowners. That's why our home ownership is now careening downwards, and it's below the EU average, and of course it's very high among people who are 50 plus. There are now more homes in the UK that are owned outright than are being bought with a mortgage, which I think is an anti-progressive situation. So house building, the housing market is no longer a source of social mobility and progress. It's a source of social immobility and rancour. The second number is 61%. That's the proportion of the homes built each year by the top 10 house builders. When there was last an inquiry into restrictive practices in house building, it was the CMA wasn't even called the CMA. It was called the OFT. It was in 2008. The conclusions of that were lost in the Lehman crisis. But then the top 10 house builders built 35% of homes, and the OFT said if it gets more concentrated, then we need to take action in order to inject serious competition, structural action, to make sure there's more competition in the supply of homes, the most important thing that almost any of us will ever buy. Well, it's now 61% and rising, not least because of the 2008 crisis, when so many small home builders were wiped out. There are many people in the Conservative Party who understand the importance of making sure capitalism works for many people. One of them is on the panel here, John Penrose, who's written some excellent stuff in this area, but it means tackling big vested interests, and the Conservative Party needs to show that it's serious about that. The third statistic is 13%. That's the share of the land mass of England that is the green belt. Lots of the green belt is aesthetically valuable, we must cherish it. Lots of the green belt is urban scrub. There's a higher share of Surrey's landmass, which is golf courses, than is housing. So if 13% of the UK English landmass is green belt, what share do you think is homes, including gardens? It's 1.7%. It's 1.7%. And if you want to see my workings on that, I'll show you. That's ridiculous. And by the way, the green belt is now 161% bigger than it was in 1979 because councils keep adding to it. We need to be serious about building in areas where people need to live, and the green belt sometimes restricts that. Fourth statistic quickly, 1.1 million. That's the number of planning permissions outstanding that aren't being used. 30% of planning permissions granted are never used. 45% in London are never used. Why? Because big house builders get the planning permissions, boost their bottom line, boost their share price, boost bonuses for executives, and they're never used. The small guys can't get them. It's not the number of planning permissions being given that's the problem. The problem is getting the planning permissions in the hands of people, small builders who will use them quickly for cash flow purposes rather than sit on them and use them as an asset management vehicle, which is our big house builders are basically landholders that do a bit of house building on the side. to keep the politicians happy. My fourth statistic is, my fifth statistic is actually a date, it's 1967. I'm 53 years old, I know I look younger, but I am. 1967 was when the new town designation order was signed for Milton Keynes. That's the last time we built a new town in this country. I'm 53, and we haven't built a new town in my lifetime. We aren't building new towns, not least because all the planning game goes to the landowners, so there's nothing to build the infrastructure with, so new towns seem to be too expensive by the state. If you change the 61 Act, the private sector and the local authorities between them will build new towns because you'll have money for the infrastructure. Since 1967, the population of this country has gone from 45 million to almost 70 million. We haven't built a new settlement in this country since the population has gone from 45 million to 70 million. That's insane. It's insane. And if you wonder why you get so many nasty houses in beautiful English villages, it's because we're not building new towns. Build some new towns and you won't need to wreck villages, and we won't have this psychodrama about the greenbelt all the time. My last number is one that Sam mentioned, and then I'll finish. It's 1.2 million. When I started writing Home Truths, it wanted to be a love letter to home ownership. I come from a first-generation home ownership family. The fact that my working-class parents managed to buy a new home revolutionised their view of themselves and of the UK. The fact that my Irish Catholic father from County Mayo, who grew up in Ireland when it was blockaded by Britain, the fact he was able to build a house revolutionised his view of England and what England meant to him as a fair place where people can come and make their way. There are 1.2 million people on council house waiting lists in this country though, and as I wrote Home Truths, I realised I was disappointed with myself. I didn't realise what a problem the lack of council housing is. We're not building any social housing to any degree, and it's largely because local authorities can't buy the land because it's so expensive because of the 1961 Land Compensation Act. That's why when it was introduced in 1961, local authorities started building massive tower blocks because they couldn't afford the land. So it strikes me that any civilised country needs to look after the most vulnerable, and the fact that we are building so-called social homes, that's why there's so much overcrowding, that's why there's so much homelessness, that's why there are so many so-called shared households. Yeah, you want to learn about shared households. There are over 1 million of them in London. That's at least 2 families living in accommodation for one. So housing is complicated. There are lots of statistics. Journalists find it almost impossible to engage with it beyond the price of their own house. But I know many people in this room are committed to trying to untie this Gordian knot, and it strikes me that unless the political and media class does address this issue, the rest of the public is not going to forgive us. Thank you.
Yes, thank you. And thank you. I actually agree with everything you've said.
My work is done.
So as a Conservative, I believe in home ownership, that everyone should have the opportunity to be able to buy their own home and live in it. And I think the government knows, every government knows they've got to build more homes and have an ambitious policy. But I just don't understand why no government has managed to do that so far. And you know, as Liam said, our population grew from 2000 to 2019 by nearly 10 million. We didn't have enough housing. New towns, absolutely right way forward. So, but just talking about home ownership, you did mention social housing, and I feel very strongly that we shouldn't forget about or ignore the necessity for the safety net, for good quality social homes that people enjoy living in. And we know that not everyone can afford to buy their own home, and that some people will spend their whole lives living in social housing, and others will use it as a springboard to buy their own home. So building new affordable homes for ownership and rent is a vital policy area. I absolutely think that we have got to look at this. And we know that good quality, safe, affordable housing provides security, improves health and well-being, and is a key factor in combating poverty and disadvantage. And the shortage of affordable housing limits families and individuals' choices about where they live, often forcing lower income families into substandard, mostly private rented housing that affects their ability to meet other expenses such as food and heating, and often forced to trade off between those basic needs. I welcome the recent announcement of the cut in stamp duty, which, if interest rates can be kept reasonably low, will encourage people to buy. But we don't have enough homes for people to buy. I'm also keen to see how new investment zones progress as regards affordable housing and homes for social rent, where there is to be a strategic direction over affordable housing fund. I understand that the all too often non-productive negotiations between councils and developers over affordable housing will be scrapped and replaced by a set percentage of affordable homes. So we all know that when you've got local development in your local area, there is a percentage that the developer has to deliver a number of affordable homes, whether for social rent or affordable homes, and suddenly it's not cost effective for them to do that, and so it's not enforced by local authorities, and I think that's something we have to look at. Hastings and Rye is the most beautiful constituency in the UK. I have to say that. Yes, absolutely. And I have to say that, and I live there, so it is. And it's got so much potential. It's a coastal community, and one of the major issues is poor quality housing and not enough social housing. And it's got some of the worst levels of deprivation in the country. So poor housing is common in coastal communities, and people end up in poor quality HMOs and private rentals. And the problem you've got, of course, is the increase in private rents going up. The local authorities then have to subsidise that more. So you get local authorities in terrible situations where they're running out of money because they can't afford to subsidise that private rental. So we've seen an increase in private rentals over the last 3 years in Hastings. And the local authorities, again, with planning, need to ensure that they are ensuring that building social housing is facilitated. Housing can make or break a child's chances in life, and I feel so strongly that we need to have children in good quality, secure homes. Coronavirus highlighted not only how important our homes are to us, but also the extent of our housing crisis and the need for affordable, secure and comfortable homes. Building social homes must be a priority of our social and economic recovery from the after effects of COVID, as well as the ongoing cost of living we're experiencing due to Putin's invasion of Ukraine. And this is all having a massive knock-on impact on this country and the rest of Europe. Building social homes will improve the lives of so many people, families living in temporary accommodation or living in overcrowded homes, rough sleepers, and those struggling to pay rent. And according to the National Housing Federation, over 60,000 families are living in temporary accommodation, with nearly 4 million people living in overcrowded homes. I don't know if you've got updated figures, but that's what I've got. Building new homes will create jobs and boost the economy. And housing associations build affordable homes and those for social rent, more than a quarter of all new homes in 2019. Then this added an estimated 2.4 billion to the national economy, supporting more than 43,000 jobs. Housing associations' day-to-day management of their existing homes adds an estimated 8 billion to the national economy, supporting more than 130,000 jobs. So I really do feel that housing associations play a massive role here. And they also help with other things, with people living in social housing, sort of employment support. So the next generation of job seekers living in social housing must be able to progress into this turbocharged jobs market that we've got at the moment, because we do have one, and they need the skills, the jobs and the career opportunities to support them. So it's not just about housing, it's about support and skills as well. Social housing providers play a vital role in supporting households and communities into sustainable livelihoods through employment, and I think that's something you might be able to pick up on when you're talking. As we're all aware, the government put in place unprecedented job support schemes and benefit increases in response to the pandemic, but data suggests that these initiatives may not be enough to support all those who need them most. And this is where universal support for those on universal credit will play a vital role, and I'd argue must be rolled out as a matter of priority now, right now. So in summary, housing, skills and employment are important for social and economic infrastructure, and it's important that the government incentivises the building and delivery of affordable homes to buy and rent, saving taxpayers' money, boosting the economy and providing the bedrock of safe and secure homes from which many of our residents will flourish.
I'm extremely sorry to be disruptive and rude, but I have to go and do my TV thing. But I'll be back.
Thank you, Liam. And
Apologies.
thank you very much. And we will be pausing for, we'll be having about half an hour of questions, so please do be thinking of your questions as we continue with the next panelists. Geeta.
Thank you, and thank you, Sally Ann, for mentioning housing associations. That was a very natural lead into what I want to talk about. So, Metropolitan Thames Valley Housing is a not-for-profit, so we're a housing association. All anything surpluses go back into providing more homes for people and important services for our residents. But we were set up back in the 50s, so we've been around a long time and are very established in the communities in which we work. So last year we built 700 homes as a housing organisation. We're the largest provider of low-cost home ownership as well, and 65% of those residents who live in our homes are on universal credit, and we are seeing some significant challenges for those residents at the moment, particularly around food and fuel. I'm also chair of the G15, and G15 has 650,000 homes. We house 1 in 10 Londoners, and it's often something people don't realise, the extent of the number of homes that we provide for people in London. And as a group, we build 10,000 homes a year, so we're a large provider of new housing, which can't be mentioned as well. Our first priority is always for our residents, and the economic benefits are there as well. So we last year we spent 900 million on our repairs and maintenance for our existing homes. But there are huge amounts of overcrowding. There is poor quality housing that we need to improve. And part of all of this means that new homes and building new homes and continuing to build new homes is an absolute priority for the nation, for us. We need to make sure we continue to build new homes. And I think, we've got lots of statistics. You're all going to be fed up with statistics by the end of this, but, we have had an affordable homes grant programme, which has allowed us to, build new homes and subsidise homes. But it was 9.4 billion as against 16.5 billion for Help to Buy. So, the need to really improve the supply and not just look at the demand is really, really important. We need to make sure that we're building the homes and building the social homes that people need. The economic benefits are huge. In the Metropolitan Thames Valley, we generate 350 million in economic contributions. And so people say, well, how do you talk about that? But 200 million of that is actually relates to the savings to the health service, it's the savings to police, savings to education. And Sally Ann rightly talked about people, kids and kids' education. If you're moving around in temporary accommodation, the disruption to those kids' lives and their start in life is absolutely massive. And we see that, in terms of how that plays through as those children get older and the support we want to provide. We provide a lot of support for housing organisations to help people into employment and training, but also to give people some very basic things, very basic needs at the moment that we're trying to fulfil around food and food and making sure children can go to school and making sure they have a decent breakfast when they get to school as well. We generate 250 million for construction and maintenance. So just as one organisation, those economic gains are 19,000 a home. So the social benefits are undeniable, but the economic benefits are equally undeniable as well. If we can build more homes and the money that goes in maintaining those homes and the benefits to those services, those additional services, is really, really important. We also did a bit of research amongst young people to find out how they feel about their housing and what is it that sort of they feel about their homes. And we found that 6 in 10 people, young people, said that their mental health was being affected by their inability to think about how they were going to be able to meet their housing sort of needs going forward. So it's having a big impact on their mental health. And 4 in 5 said life decisions were being affected, whether they have children, whether they have a second child, how near they live to their parents, and have that sort of community support that's so needed. So we know that the social impact on young people as they think about it, and there are an absolute need to make sure we educate people better on the solutions there are for their housing at much younger ages and organisations. So what do we need in terms of building more? I mean, I've worked in housing a very long time, over 30 years, and housing crisis has been used in almost every year of my whole career. So the first thing is ambition. Liam talked about what was achieved many years ago, and that's because there was the ambition and there was the funding to match it and the planning policy that meets it. We work in very short cycles in housing, very short funding cycles in housing, whereas transport is much longer. Obviously it's an infrastructure, but if we can see housing as an infrastructure, we can have those 10-year programmes and that commitment, then we'll be able to achieve so much more than the short-term funding cycles that we work in. Securing public land. There is a lot of public land, and there has been a lot said about utilising that public land for the benefit of those organisations. But we need to make sure that there is political will to use that public land as a subsidy to provide subsidised housing. And if every organisation takes the best value and uses that, so the health service uses that, for example, for benefits within the health service, we're not going to have that overarching ability to put that subsidy into more social housing. 50% of affordable housing is delivered through Section 106, through the current planning system. So when we make the changes, we need to be very careful that that ambition and that delivery of affordable housing still is achieved, because if we turn something off and we introduce something else, we have to be aware of the consequences of the middle issues start with it as well. And just to say, there are a lot of headwinds for housing associations. We have costs around building safety as a rising as a cladding prices. We have decarbonisation targets that we have to meet, some investment into our existing homes, rent caps that are currently being discussed. We can only do so much, and we, in the last 2008, when there was the last big slowdown of housing, we completed 43% of all new homes. So if we're taken out of the equation as the builders or developers of new homes because of these other headwinds and not unable to carry out that task, who will do it? So I think it's a really important point as we go into sort of more difficult economic time. And public support is really important as well. So just in summary, we need to know what we want to do, where we want to do it, and how we're going to do it, and build that real public consensus to enable us to deliver the homes. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Geeta.
Well, Sam, thank you very much. And I've got to say, it's dead easy speaking last, because I agree with pretty much everything that's been said. So shall we just get on with it? No, we won't. The point about this, though, is it's right, isn't it, that this is something which we're sitting in a room surrounded by banners for social justice, because what we're talking about here is something which is fundamentally unjust. The effects which we're all living with are not fair. They're not fair a whole range of reasons. There's a generational injustice. If the only people who can afford homes either to rent or to buy are over 40, and in many cases over 60. So there's a huge generational skew in our housing market, and that ain't right. It's bad for opportunity, it's bad for hope, and it's unfair. There's a geographical injustice, because as we've just heard, if you live in London or in some parts of the rest of the country as well, then either to rent or to buy, housing is just massively less affordable than it is in other places. geography shouldn't be destiny, but at the moment it is. And if you're faced with a choice about, I can either have my job that I like and my family and my friends here, or I've got to move somewhere, that's not right either. That's not a great society to be living in, and yet that's what we have over decades as a country managed to create. There's a class injustice too. We don't talk very much about class in the Conservative Party, but actually what it means is, if you are fortunate enough to be born with posh rich parents who can afford to help you get on the housing ladder, or perhaps subsidise your rent, then it makes a heck of a difference to your life chances. That's not right either, and as a party that believes in equal opportunities and in levelling up, why the heck are we letting that happen either? It's just not fair. And not only is it all not fair, it's also economically disastrous as well. Because if you just think about the effects on our nation's economic productivity of really high prices for any part of our lives, but particularly for something which is unavoidable because everybody has to have it, i.e. housing and homes, then what that means is you get systematic misallocation of capital, you get bad performance economically. The economy is just not as efficient as it could be if housing, whether to rent or to buy, was a heck of a lot cheaper. So, and this is not a comment on Conservative governments, this is a comment on about 40 years of successive governments. We have monumentally bogged this up, ladies and gentlemen, and we absolutely have to do something, and that's why the panel is all right. I think there are two main areas. One, and we mentioned it a couple of times, but and as a party, we tend to focus, if we're not careful, very much on home ownership, and home ownership is vital. I'm completely with you on that. But we mustn't forget tenure and rental, because that is, as we've just heard, increasingly important for anybody up to 40, whether we like it or not. And the rental bill, or the renters bill, which is upcoming in Parliament, is going to be absolutely essential to improve tenures, but also to improve, if we do it right, the rights of landlords when they're dealing with either good tenants or bad tenants. That is absolutely essential to improve the stability of tenure, so that you can't, if you are a renter, you can't be chucked out at the whim of a landlord unless they've got good cause, unless you're a terrible tenant. But it also means, if you're a landlord, that you aren't at the mercy of nightmare tenants you can't get rid of, who completely mess up your business model. Some landlords are already very, very good at this. Many of the social landlords, for example, are adept at handling this and have big staff that are experts in this. But for a number of other landlords at the moment, we urgently need to provide cleaner, simpler, easier frameworks. The good landlords will make those work just as well as the old ones, but for others it will make a huge difference. But the point about ownership, and also if you make houses cheaper to own, obviously it makes them cheaper to rent as well, is the supply. One thing which we are really good at in this party is understanding economics and supply and demand, and this is clearly a problem of supply. It has been. We have not been building enough houses of any kind, of any tenure, for decades and decades and decades. And incidentally, we need to be quite careful. So some people will stand up and say, we've got to build more houses for this type of tenure or that type of tenure, for rent, to own, for shared ownership, whatever it might be. Actually, once you've built the box, over the lifetime of most buildings, they go through a whole series of different tenures quite commonly. The important thing is to build the box in the first place, and then the market secondarily will take care of whether or not it then gets rented out at some point in the future, or bought or split up into flats or whatever. You've just got to build the boxes in the first place. Now, you've got to build the boxes in the right places. You've got to build the boxes that look beautiful and good, because the other thing about homes is they all form part of the backdrop to our lives. Every time you walk down the street, you're walking through the public realm. That is the product of successive generations of housing decisions and planning decisions, design decisions, good or bad. And your neighbourhood can be plug ugly, or it can be absolutely gorgeous, depending on how well the last 40 years, in some cases 400 years, of planning decisions have been taken. And so what we've got to do is to free up that supply. And there's some almost brilliant ideas out there at the moment, almost done, but we never quite finished them. So, for example, if you take urban areas in the sector, the average height of most British towns, excluding city centres, but the average height of most British towns is about 2 stories tall. Yeah. But actually, if you look at some really good-looking bits of an awful lot of British towns and cities, they're 4 stories tall, 4 or 5 stories tall. Classic, beautiful townhouses, whether they're in Bath or in London or in Buxton, wherever it might be, about 4 or 5 stories tall, and you can get much greater density in a really good-looking, beautiful urban environment without having to concrete over green fields or concrete over urban parks. You can just say we're going to allow people to build up a little bit, not tower blocks, up to sort of townhouse height. And you do that in conjunction with a local design code, a local set of plans that says, here's what the local vernacular style is, we'd like more of it to look like this, we're going to choose the best looking stuff in our particular town, our particular village, our particular community, and if you build more stuff like this, don't worry about getting planning permission because you're pre-approved. And actually, it's some of the best stuff that we have in this country already, much of it built in the 18th and 19th century. Quite a lot of that was built on something called a pattern book. And you had, you said, I'm going to build a street of the stuff you'll find on page 20. And you knew that if you built the stuff on page 20, no one was going to come along with a clipboard and a peak cap and say you can't build that area because it was pre-approved. And it dramatically simplifies all the stuff which is currently being used by the, let's call it the oligopoly of existing very large house builders because they're better at making the existing system work. But if you simplify it, then all those small builders, and indeed small builders who could then become small developers, come back into the market and say, well, I can do that. I can buy two sides of a semi-detached, and I can turn that into something beautiful, and I know I've got the permission because it's all in advance. Oh, that's easy. Well, I can do that. And the advantage as well is that if you own one of those sites, it's a massive piece of wealth creation too, because everybody who owns a two-storey home suddenly becomes sitting on a huge amount of potential planning gain. There's a whole load of stuff about planning gain which we also need to do. I would just make it an awful lot simpler and say you should have a tariff up front, and when you get planning permission on a new site or to extend an existing site, you pay it on the day that you get the planning permission. Not later, not after you've had an appeal, not after you've employed expensive lawyers. You pay it on the day you get the planning permission, because that's when the wealth is created on a preset tariff published by your council, so you know that it's going to be 50% or 30% or 70%. It can be cash, it can be a percentage of social housing, but it gets paid on the day the wealth is created. No ifs, no buts, no maybes. If you don't pay, you don't get your planning permission. And at that point, you get rid of all the lawyer-friendly stuff in Section 106s and all the lawyer-friendly stuff in the infrastructure levy stuff. And the only people who will be not on my Christmas card list or will not be sending me Christmas cards will be the planning lawyers. But that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, John. I'll try to remember to send you a Christmas card. We'll go to questions. Who would like to start with the first question? Yes, over there.
Yeah, thank you very much. Julian Glenn, I'm the group leader on Ealing Council. I sit on planning committee a lot, so I deal with those things in Section 106 and planning consent. And planning consent obviously is one big problem because it's given, and then you find the planning applications coming back for another 2 stories and things not getting built, and so that is a problem. But the question I have actually is a very short one. We talk a lot about house building. Maintenance of council-owned property and social housing-owned property is a big problem. Getting it done, people may not be aware, but overcrowding can actually cause building degradation itself, and I see that a lot. Any thoughts on that? Any thoughts on how we could sort of streamline that and make the process quicker?
Yeah, I mean, we have a real skills shortage at the moment. And we're seeing that more and more, and I'm sure you see that in Ealing as well. So there has been a real, I suppose, flight over many years of those trades. And I think one of the things we need to make sure we do is to rebuild up the skills that are required. I mean, in social housing, you have a social rent. You have a rent which is capped at a certain level, and there's a huge amount that's meant to be completed within that rent. And if we want major investment in that stock, we're going to have to think about how that's going to be paid for, because at the moment, there are many calls, as I said, on the cash and the income that we get from our rent. So I think there's 2 things. We really need to think if there's going to be an upgrade of existing homes, then we need to have a different mechanism other than just through the rent that pay for it. And if we don't have the skills that are there, if we're not investing and really changing the way we acquire those skills from our residents, but other people, or through immigration, then we're going to have a real problem, because we haven't got the people here who are going to help us with decarbonisation needs. We haven't got the people who can do some of the basic plumbing, electrical works that are required within our stock, and we haven't got the people who can do, you know, the major investment we need. And every time we come up with a new programme and have a deadline on it, then all you know, there's a kind of peak and a trough really of spending the money and getting things done. So that's another problem that we have. So I think it's a really important point to raise.
Thank you, Geeta. And Sally-Ann?
Yes, just picking up on that. So Optivo is a big social housing provider in Hastings and Rye, and they've got a bit big to really localise it enough. What they had done, so a lot of the emails I get from constituents aren't just about the quality of their private rentals, but also about the poor quality of their social home, because it hasn't been maintained properly. And somewhere like Optivo had sort of outsourced the maintenance. They've now brought it back in-house to make it more locally focused. And I think it's a perfect opportunity, actually, for housing associations to take on apprenticeships, to train people up in maintenance. They're often based in parts where there is no employment and opportunity, and it's exactly the sort of area that actually they could train up people locally and join that maintenance team.
Thank you, Sally-Ann.
Which we do.
Yes. Next, can we continue the next question? That's the next one. Yes, at the back. Yourself, yes.
I'm really sorry. I'm Hilary McVitie from the Building Society Association. I may be living here in political cloud cuckoo land, in which case I apologise. How do we get to a point, and if this goes back to something that Geeta said, of actually having a long-term, joined up, cross-departmental, related to infrastructure, housing policy in this country? Because the government has done a lot of really good things, a lot of good initiatives, Help to Buy was mentioned, but a lot of those are demand side, and what they've been doing is just stimulating in a market which is sort of too much demand, not enough supply, has just been pushing house prices up and exacerbating the problem. How do we get to some kind of long-term policy rather than short-term initiatives?
You just survived.
Well, as I was saying,
You've actually been to the pub for a few minutes.
I generally go to the pub at sort of 10 to 9. I'm usually coming home, actually. It's very, very difficult because we're taking on very big vested interests. While I was away, somebody tweeted that they don't understand what I said before about what the motivations of the big house builders. Look, the big house builders, they're making margins of like 25 or 30% on house building. This is a Victorian era technology. This is not difficult stuff. It's difficult to build houses well, but not if you've got a bit of experience. To make 25 to 30% margins on the production of something that is so ubiquitously needed, for which there is huge demand, and the technology is not particularly difficult, you know, it shows that capitalism isn't working. The big house builders make more money by building fewer houses. If you read my book, you'll learn about a concept that I created called contrived scarcity. It's not a particularly new concept at all. Asked Teddy Roosevelt. So this goes back, but anyway. So for the person who doesn't understand, the book's on the table, and I'll even, if you buy one and send it to me, I'll even sign it. On the issue of a joined-up policy, it is very difficult because we are dealing with, you know, enormous vested interests, and these vested interests are very close to the Conservative Party. Those aren't my words; they are the words of somebody called Roger Scruton, who you may have heard of, and many senior Conservatives, you know, who I've known for many years. They're friends of mine. Acknowledge this. Many friends of mine who are MPs acknowledge that when it comes to planning, just say no if you want to survive politically. That is the reality. It's a Gordian knot, as I mentioned earlier, which we need to break. And we can say that Help to Buy was a good thing because we may all know a young family who got on the housing ladder using Help to Buy. And I don't begrudge them that at all. I wish them well. But it was a terrible policy because it juiced up the demand side. And the vast majority of people who didn't get access to those Help to Buy loans, housing was even more unaffordable for them. And of course, Help to Buy, the vast majority of it was hoovered up by the large oligopolistic house builders, so it actually consolidated their grip on the market. It meant that they had nailed on profits. During that period, they built thousands of substandard homes because of Help to Buy, many of which didn't have fire insulation in them. There are legal cases going on now that I rarely hear mentioned in Parliament. So we do have potentially a really good house building industry in this country, and there's a tremendous opportunity, as we heard earlier, I think you said it, Sally Ann, to juice up the economy with house building. Yeah, every recovery from recession in the last 150 years has been associated with a big rise in house building, except the recovery from the recession of 2008-9, and it was the most thin, weak, non-convincing recovery from recession that we've ever seen. And that wasn't a coincidence.
With just under 15 minutes to go, I'm keen to take a few more questions. So, yes, someone in front.
Jamie Ratcliffe, Biteback Homes. Apologies, it was me that tweeted that. I've got a copy of your book already.
Oh, sorry.
Clearly, we'll make that later. So I just had a question around. So, in the face of the rapidly rising cost of living, governments decided that instead of providing targeted support to the people that need it most, they want to cap social housing rents, and that is far below the level of inflation that housing associations are facing. That's inevitably going to have negative impacts on all the economic and social infrastructure, all the social value that's being offered by the G15, negatively impact on the social injustices that you talked about, and also reduce the number of homes that housing associations can buy. And so I just wanted to ask you, if you were Simon Clarke, would you choose the 7%, 5% or 3% cap?
That's a good question.
The simple answer is I would hate to choose any of them because, as I said earlier on when Liam was out of the room, the fundamental problem here is supply. So what I would do is I would free up the supply in the ways that I was just describing, which others have talked about too. Do that immediately, and while that wouldn't have an effect tomorrow, it would start to have an effect within by next year. And once people can see that prices to both rent and to buy are starting to fall, and it won't be immediate, it won't be quick, but it'll be a slow and steady process, then yeah, all right. At that point, as a free marketeer, I can kind of clench my teeth and sort of cross my fingers and say, all right, we may have to do some unpleasant, non-market, short-term measures, but I know they're short-term. I can put a sunset clause on them if I have to make sure that they evaporate after a period of time, because I know that the fundamentals underlying all this are headed in the right direction for the first time in 40 years. And so please don't ask me to choose between three awful choices, but I would choose one of them if I know that the fundamentals underlying this are headed in the right direction at last.
We've had 4 years of rent decreases previously, just getting back into having rent increases and now caps potentially that are coming. If you want a consistent model to allow you to continue investing in your stock and also investing in new homes, we haven't got it. So, I would leave it to housing associations to choose, and they would do the right thing by their residents, because they always do the right thing by their residents, and let them choose so that they can make the right decisions and not go into economic turmoil as a result of it.
Yes, next question.
Hello, sorry, Kim Taylor-Smith, Deputy Leader of Kensington Chelsea Council. So I live in a parallel universe. Our average house sale this year was 2.1 million. We have probably one of the largest homelessness lists in London. We're one of the most densely populated boroughs as well. I have two questions. First of all, I have a real fear with housing associations and their stock in the borough. We're spending 600 million on our housing stock. We only have a small amount of 6,500. What we're seeing is a flight from high value areas of London, high density and development, not understandably because of land values. So I wonder how we might stop that. And the second point is that if you're homeless in Birmingham, you don't get rehoused in Edgbaston. In London, if you're homeless, you're rehoused by the borough where you live. And so what is the view of the panel on a pan-London approach, or even talk about a pan-national approach on giving people a home? Because I believe people have to have a good quality home, access to services, not necessarily whether they're bought up, but I'm always accused of social cleansing when I say that. So I just wanted to know what your views were. Thank you.
Sally-Ann?
Yes, I actually think we need to provide homes where people live, and that they shouldn't have to go outside the area where they may have a job or where their family are in order to own a home. So I would disagree with you on that. And I think, from a coastal community, Hastings, which has got some of the worst levels of deprivation in the country, one of our jobs as a government is to ensure that the opportunities for housing and employment are in Hastings, and they don't need to leave their community in order to access those. Because one of the things you find over the last few decades is the crumbling of family and community structures, because people are having to move away from where they were born and brought up with their family support structure, their community support structure, and this is what we have got to face as a country and put it right.
Can I just respond and just say that works for Hastings, but I've got 2,100 people in temporary accommodation in a very dense borough, so I don't have the space. I'd love to give people the space. We've got a new homes programme, we're building 600 new homes, but we're full.
Can I mention something there? There's obviously a balance to be struck here. One way to try and help ease that trade-off is to use government-owned land. Now, this is an old kind of hoary chestnut, but the government owns 6% of the land in this country, and it's not just sort of MOD sites on Salisbury Plain and etc. etc. NHS trusts own huge amounts of land in central cities that they're not using. And in documentaries I've made in the past for dispatches about housing, we've tried to find out why this land couldn't be sold to local authorities so they could build decent social housing. The tapestry of a great city isn't that you have very large, extremely wealthy areas that almost become gated communities, and then areas that aren't wealthy. People need to interact, people need to employ one another and rub up against each other. That's the mark of a civilized society, I would say. And what I've been struck by, and many ministers I've spoken to over many years connected with housing, so they always come up against this Treasury orthodoxy. There you go, buzzword bingo. The Treasury orthodoxy that they won't sell off land because they think, oh, we might get a higher price for it next year. There's this kind of sense that if you do a deal within government, or if government oversees a developer housing association taking a plot of land that's in the middle of a city, and there are plots like this not just in our regional cities but in our capital city as well, and building relatively low density, high quality social housing and affordable housing, so we can have more mixed communities even in the most expensive areas like K&C and so on. There's always a sort of Treasury dogma that says, no, we can't do that. There are always reasons found for why it can't be sold, not understanding that, look, if you build this social housing, then maybe the housing benefit bill, which is 30 billion quid a year, because we haven't got enough social housing, so people are bed and breakfasting and rapacious private sector landlords that we all know about. Not all landlords, of course, but some landlords who are basically their main customer is the state. The standards are not good, and anyone that doesn't understand that isn't paying attention. So one way to break this deadlock is for the state to use its land, for that Treasury orthodoxy about not selling off land because you might get a better price tomorrow, to be smashed. You've got to look at the thing in the round. If you build more social housing, you ease so many other parts of the budget, and also you generate actual communities. How important is it for a working class kid to live around the house, round the corner from their grandmother? That lets the mum work. That means the kid sees work happening rather than living on benefits. That's priceless. And the state needs to show a lot more imagination by using the land that the state owns to allow social housing to be built in conjunction with the housing associations. It's a completely obvious thing to do, but every time it's tried, it comes up against what I can only describe as the blob, and the blob needs to be smashed up.
Thank you, Liam. On this question, I know both Geeta and Don would like to come in as well. So
I just want to make two very, very small, quick points. One is this point about social cleansing. I think the point in London is very different than, for example, the point that Sally Ann was making about Hastings, because London has a much more developed public transport system, and therefore you can get around London much more easily. You can get around some rural areas, or indeed some urban areas in other parts of the country. So we just could be aware of the fact that the geography is different in different parts of the country, and therefore I think it should be a travel to work time rather than a number of miles apart that you can talk about to expect people to move before it starts to become antisocial, to break up families and break up communities. But that's just a sort of a point of not trying to create a cookie cutter solution for the entire country. The other point, just as strength for Liam's elbow in his crusade against the blob and against the Treasury orthodoxy, there's a rather handy other bit of Treasury orthodoxy that you can quote against them when they start saying, oh, well, we should hang on to these sites and we might get a better price next year or next week or whatever it might be. And that is what the economists call the velocity of money. In other words, if you have a site, a valuable asset sitting there doing nothing or being used for a purpose which is well below its potential, that's an enormous economic cost. It's an enormous reduction in the economy's productivity. And the economists and the flinty-eyed folk in the Treasury do understand that. And if you can quote that bit at them, then we can watch smoke come out of their ears and their brain should explode.
Yeah. I suppose just two quick points is we need to look at existing housing as well as new housing. So, there is social housing that's been lost out of the social housing sector because of the, is it fit for purpose? What's the investment that's needed? So I think we need to think about that. And regeneration as well. At the moment, the kind of rules, there's lots of rules, but the rules to allow regeneration of the existing estates is complex. So if you want to provide better homes or additional homes, there are rules around that. So I think we need to look a lot more at the existing estates and the existing homes that we have. And I think there are in London, we've had huge development out in areas like Barking and Dagenham. There is Old Common, which is a massive area in London which is there for us to take advantage of and build more housing and build more social housing. So I think when you have those larger schemes for regeneration schemes, we need a more sensible look at how that impacts London. But every London borough has got the statistics that you're quoting, and that is the key issue. Every London borough, because we haven't done enough, is seeing and has seen for a long time those increases in homelessness. But I think we do need some more sensible pan-London views around larger schemes and larger estates and larger land holdings which we can bring forward.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, that does bring us to past. So I'm very sorry, I know there are many more questions on this topic. Let's keep the conversation going. Please stay in touch with us at CSJ. We have touched on the question of thriving communities. We do have a panel on that later today if you'd like to join, as well as many other panels on other topics we're working on. Please do come and take part. The panelists may have, I know they're very busy, they may have a moment to hang around if you have additional questions. I think this last question was a great call to arms as we go out to take on the blob and develop great homes for people to live in. So let's thank our panelists with a round of applause.